Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
There are different aspects of being alone that might be more worrisome or more problematic for some versus others. For some who are very well off financially, it's the loneliness. For those who worry about money, it is a major concern. I mean, older adults overwhelmingly receive Social Security to help them.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. This week, kinlessness. You've probably never heard the term, but Americans who are kinless are a part of a growing demographic. The Journals of Gerontology produced a study that reports an estimated 6.6% of Americans, adults 55 plus, have no living spouse or biological children. That was in 2017. In 2019, close to 1 million older Americans didn't have a spouse or partner, children, or siblings. That includes 370,000 women over the age of 75. Joining us today is Dr. Deborah Carr, a sociologist and researcher at Boston University. Dr. Carr says all the pathways to kinlessness or older singlehood have grown. Okay, Dr. Carr, welcome and thank you for your time and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
So explain what that means and why that's happened. All the past pathways to singlehood have grown.
Sure. We have more people growing old alone today than ever before. And the main pathways are one, being single for your entire life, being a lifelong single. That's something that we have seen increasing, and it's continuing to increase with baby boomers and Generation X after them. The other pathway is divorce. We know that divorce rates rose dramatically in the 1970s. Then they tapered off in the 80s, but it was that cohort of baby boomers who not only divorced in their 30s, but then again when they reached their 50s, the rates of gray divorce, meaning divorce in one's 50s and older, also increased. And then that final pathway is widowhood. And that's always been one of the main pathways to being alone in time periods when people married in large numbers. And that's something that's persisted, certainly during COVID, and especially for women, because men are more likely to die younger or to die first in the couple, leaving women on their own.
How much more likely are men to die first than women?
Much more likely. If you look at the population of people age 65 and older, there are about 3 women for every 2 men. If you look at the population 85 plus, as you'll see visiting a nursing home, there are 3 women for every 1 man. So it's really quite disproportionate. Men do die younger of heart disease and a range of other illnesses, which means leaving their wives often for long periods of time on their own.
We also know that young men die in motorcycle wrecks and car wrecks, in dangerous activities, using weapons, way more than young women. So if you take out the cohort of men dying under the age of 30, or even just men dying accidental deaths, is it still that striated? Is it still that much that women way outlive men?
Women still do outlive men, even in older age, but you're right that men have higher rates of death than women at every stage. Even in infancy, baby boys die younger because they have weaker cardiopulmonary systems. In their teenage years, the boys have more accidents, right? More car accidents, more firearm deaths. So at every single age, the women are outpacing men. But then even if you look at the population 65 plus, men do have higher mortality rates than women, although it absolutely starts to converge more so than it would have earlier in life.
So what's the first piece of advice you offer to a 35-year-old woman now about how to prepare for, and one would hope avoid, kinlessness in old age.
One thing we need to do is change the narrative that being alone and feeling alone are not the same thing. There are, in fact, some women who do not have a spouse, they do not have children, and that is absolutely fine with them. They have their friends, they have their romantic partners, they have hobbies and work colleagues. And most of the evidence shows that they age very well, thank you. More so if they have education and income, which gives them that financial cushion as they age. So we don't want it to be entirely doom and gloom, because we don't want 35-year-old women to marry hastily or capriciously just so they're not on their own. But there are real issues for being alone. Having one source of income rather than two means less economies of scale. And that's a major reason why women are far more likely than men to live in poverty in old age. Being alone means fewer helpers. If one needs care with medication or care getting to the doctor, or God forbid, there's a natural disaster, assistance with relocation, right, or evacuation. So having another person in your midst, whether it's a spouse or a child or a niece or nephew, really becomes all the more important as people age. One piece of advice is round out your social network in a way that works for you, because you're going to need those social ties.
There was an article in the New York Times about this a couple of months ago, which was the genesis of our interest in interviewing you and doing a show about it. But also, I am married to a man, longtime married to a man 6 years older than I am, and and because of injuries, I have a lifelong passion with horseback riding, and was showing, and had some serious injuries. So I'm a lot more incapacitated than I expected I would be in old age. Stuff happens, And I have a sister whom I love and am close to over the phone, but we live hundreds of miles away from each other. We've never talked about living together again in old age. So this whole issue of kinlessness struck home with me. Now, one difference is I don't know why, but from my teens, 20s, I was petrified of being a single woman or widowed woman alone and poor and older. And so I started saving literally when I was making $15,000 a year as a local news reporter in Tampa, Florida in the 70s. I started socking away small bits, and the power of compound interest, which is a cliche, but it's true. 40, 50 years later, I have a very nice nest egg. That still doesn't make me unafraid of losing my spouse and living by myself. So what do you say to women?
I think you raised a really important point that there are different aspects of being alone that might be more worrisome or more problematic for some versus others. For some who are very well off financially, it's the loneliness. It's the not having someone to go places with. It's not having a medical decision maker. If that's the case, then the advice would be a quite different pathway. It would be really to invest in friendships or even legal relationships, appointing a healthcare proxy, for instance, who's a lawyer or a healthcare provider. For those who worry about money, it is a major concern. I mean, older adults overwhelmingly receive Social Security to help them, but we know even though Social Security benefits have been increasing, they're still modest. They're not enough to pay for everything that an older person needs, especially with inflation, especially with rising rates of healthcare. So people need another source of income, and the main source of income is a private pension. It's a luxury to have a private pension, but for anybody who has the opportunity to have a pension at their job, the recommendation is to put as much money in as you can, provided you don't need it to make those kind of current day purchases, right? Like rent. Another is savings, kind of save money. To the extent that you can invest wisely. And then living frugally is never a bad thing. Those of us who had Depression era parents or grandparents learned at young ages how to sock away. and how to buy things in a frugal manner, how to pare down, right? It's good for the environment and it's good for our wallet. So really being mindful and not feeling any great need to keep up with the Joneses in terms of consumption patterns is something else that I think younger generations today really should heed as an important life lesson.
Exactly. And how do you avoid, I mean, aside from the obvious advice of don't let your circle get smaller, but it's kind of hard not to. Uh, Again, from personal experience, if just by being physically disabled to a limited extent, but still disabled, um, and not going out as much. And I remember when I was working, I had 30 good friends, and now that I'm heading into retirement and spend much more time at home because of my disabilities. What do? Join Zoom clubs or something for older people to make friends? I don't know.
You're right. It's easier said than done. You can't just tell someone, go make a friend. Okay, I'll make a friend. And we know for people who don't have children, that's all the more difficult, especially at midlife, right? You have to kind of forge these networks on your own. And I think it really comes down to identifying what your needs are and trying to figure out who in your circle can meet that. So emotional needs, for instance, having someone to talk to about your problems or feelings or bounce ideas around. That kind of relationship absolutely can be handled through Zoom, through telephone, through letter writing or text for those who are so inclined. So emotional needs can be met through these virtual ties if someone is comfortable with the technology. In terms of practical assistance, there's something to be said for the fact that your Facebook friends, your 300 Facebook friends, aren't going to bring you chicken soup when you're sick. So identifying people, even if it's one or two people who are proximate, who can be a helper in terms of helping, again, with errands, helping you get up the stairs if you take a fall and hurt yourself. I think finding one or two people who can be a helper, whether it's a niece, whether it's a neighbor or former coworker that one feels comfortable with and trusts. That's really important. Some much older adults they lose a little bit of their capacity to have that edge. And so some do trust people who are harmful to them. The other is sometimes there are institutional structures, geriatric social workers. Meals on Wheels is actually a really fantastic program, not just because of the food, because it's someone to check in on a daily basis or a weekly basis to make sure someone's doing okay. Some regions have villages programs. If you're familiar with the villages, it's a way that you stay in your own home. You pay a small sum each year, and then maybe you will help your neighbors with the internet and they may cook dinner and another person will work on your garden. So the villages is a really fantastic program that the costs of paying to participate are not that high. So sometimes if we really feel there's no one in our immediate midst, we can reach out a little bit more and rely on these structures that are actually quite good and that are growing in number.
You mentioned Zoom calls and that sort of thing. Are there any websites that are really good for seniors who see their circle of contacts and friends shrinking as they get older, where they can, I mean, they certainly have romance hookup websites. What about friendship?
AARP has a lot of different platforms. They launched a dating site that did kind of extraordinarily well for people age 55 plus. I'm not aware of any nationals because that is really difficult to maintain, but there are plenty that are interest group specific, right? It's not like all of a sudden someone turns 65 and they all develop a passion for mahjong. No, those people who like rock and roll at 17 years old or classical music or mystery novels, they can find their own groups. So one way to do that is at the local level, look at one's local church or synagogue or Department of Elderly Affairs sometimes has lists of online activities or even online programming, right? They might have a weekly Pilates class online, a weekly book group online, and that could transfer into live interactions. But AARP does have things like dance parties online for people to stay engaged. So kind of know your interests and then follow that trail to find like-minded people. And then finally, kind of sadly, there are support groups for very specific things. Loss of a child, loss of a spouse, managing dementia, managing prostate cancer. So there are interest-specific groups that with a little bit of legwork, people can find their kindred spirits online.
Tell me about other interesting data nuggets that have come out of your study.
One important one is that, again, loneliness and being alone are not the same thing. And in fact, this is kind of a sad fact, but about a third of older adults who are married report feeling lonely. And that proportion is even higher for married people at younger ages. So marriage is not a panacea. And in fact, we want to make sure that those who are in marriages that are either stale emotionally or that have taken a turn because one has a major health problem or depression, that they're not providing that support, that those people also feel that they should seek out emotional support. A spouse cannot be everything to someone, as that stat of 30% most certainly conveys. So I think that's another important point.
I mean, it's really often counterproductive for either spouse to look to each other as, constant companion, best friend, all the, you run out of things to talk about when you're only interacting with one person. You're limiting yourself in so many ways. It's just not a healthy human behavior. And yet, especially, I see older women doing that. Another thing is grandchildren. There's so many older people. I saw my stepmother do it. When my father died, she moved a couple hours away to be close to my sister and her then, who, now finishing college, then small child, granddaughter. And I talked to my ex-sister-in-law recently. She lives in the LA area. That's where she raised her two daughters, my nieces. They're both up in the Pacific Northwest now. And my sister-in-law said, I think, in a couple of years, I'm going to be moving to the Pacific Northwest. I think a lot of people do that. And then to be with grandchildren, the grandchildren grow up and move on. They don't, there are very few teenagers who want to hang out with grandma and grandpa, or even preteens. It just becomes uncool. You want to be out there with your friends, and that's an important part of psychological development and the ability to take care of yourself in this dog-eat-dog world.
There's a clear thread through between what you've said both about spouses and about children and grandchildren. And it has to do with this, which is managing expectations. No one relationship can or should be everything to one person. And especially, we know that relationships change over time. So marriages, even if you're best friends, once you're retired, you have fewer things to talk about, right? Your lives all become much more similar. And so it really is wise to have some activities on one's own or new shared activities together. So you have something to talk about rather than rehashing something that happened in 1985 that's become kind of a tired story. And the same is true for children. Children leave the nest, grandchildren kind of strike out on their own. And in many cases, they may indeed enjoy their grandparents' company, right? Many of us love being with our grandparents. But for some, you're absolutely right. They don't want to spend all their time together, and they're not going to change their routine. And I think that's something really important. Just because an older adult might choose to go live with a child or grandchild doesn't mean that they're going to put their life on hold. They have their jobs, they have their friends, they have their routines. And if they're good, kind people, they would try to incorporate their parent or grandparent in that routine. But we cannot expect anybody to do a complete transition of their own lives to accommodate someone else. And that's especially the case if it wasn't a good relationship. I think that's something we need to talk about, that many of us are lucky to have wonderful families, but there is a good number of older adults who have strained relationships with their children, who are estranged from their children. And that's not magically going to become a lovely relationship just because one of them has a change of heart about reestablishing it.
I also think in the case of grandkids, it's important for grandparents to recognize that it's healthy for their grandkids to take off and build their own lives. It's kind of unhealthy to want to smother them with your constant company after they reach a certain age, because part of teenage rebellion is because adolescence, so it's ingrained emotionally that they need to leave the cocoon of the home, the parents, the grandparents, and strike out on their own to establish their own lives. And if they grow up totally dependent on a relative, that's not healthy.
Individuation is just such an important thing for adolescents to kind of establishing who they are. I think there is a way for them to do that while still maintain these ties with their grandparents. And I think one thing we want to do is make sure that, grandchildren aren't perpetuating ageism, right? It's very easy to say, these people are older, they're boring, they don't understand me. But most older adults can and do learn. During the pandemic, older people got online in great numbers. They started using telehealth, and older adults have stories, they have past, they used drugs at some point, they had sexual relations at some point. They're not these squares that sometimes the younger generation thinks. Grandchildren can learn about family history from their parents or grandparents. They love hearing stories about what it was like in the olden days. And likewise, children have things they can teach their grandparents about technology or about pop culture. So I think whatever can be done to have kind of a balanced relationship where one isn't the giver and one's the givee can really help those relationships to thrive and flourish.
And let me just be clear. I'm talking about when a grandchild is 7 to 12 years old, the grandparent gets used to seeing them for the whole evening every day when they come home for going to school, picking them up, bringing them home, cooking dinner, spending the whole evening together. And while the 14-year-old may want to do that for an hour, it's healthy for him or her not to want to do it anymore for all their free time, which is after school.
For grandparents, if they can kind of think back to their own child's milestones, right, of when they wanted to kind of do things on their own, that can be a helpful template for the grandchildren as well.
But you talked about the numbers of men dying sooner and younger on average than women, is this whole cougar syndrome, which I'm sure happened throughout history, of older single women taking on younger boyfriends, especially if they have a bit of financial stability. And that, as some retirees actually do have. And that would also help widen your circle of connections with other friends, with neighbors, with what have you, with the relatives of the person you get together with. How is that a growing trend?
I don't know if it's a growing trend. I think it's definitely something that happens. Most of the data on remarriage, for the most part, shows that it's still the men who are partnering with women considerably younger than themselves in larger numbers than vice versa. But it certainly happens, and it can happen for a variety of reasons. Women today, and men for that matter, are taking really good care of themselves, both physically and in terms of health. So a woman who is 65 may well look closer to 40. She might be able to run marathons. There's absolutely no reason why she can't keep up with a man 20 years her junior, just as men have kept up with, female partners 20 years their junior for a long time period. And then women who have a lot of economic resources, they don't need to rely on a new partner for financial security. So that gives them much more latitude of who to date. And it could be dating younger. I also think for some older women, they feel it's a desirable option. And I say this for an important reason. Oftentimes when a woman becomes widowed, there's some evidence that she doesn't go out with the old friendship circles anymore. And this is kind of a dated notion, but it still sort of happens, that she doesn't want to be the fifth wheel of all the couples, or she doesn't want to be seen as the one kind of hitting on other people's husbands. So sometimes just reestablishing an entirely new circle does work for some women. Not all, right? It's a minority, but that is something that you do see.
Right. And I've also heard some women describe it as, all of a sudden my friends kind of treated me like widowhood was contagious. Like for the still married couples, didn't want to hang around with a single woman because, oh my God, what if what happened to her happens to me? As if it were some kind of thing that you could pass from person to person, like a disease.
And it does bring up people's worst fears. We know that fear of death is something that's very common. And I also know as a bereavement researcher, people don't know what to do or say when someone dies. They become flummoxed. They don't know what to say. They think it's going to be depressing if they talk to a widow or widower about their former spouse. So sometimes people do nothing at all and they don't reach out. Not to be cruel, but just because that awkwardness or discomfort is something that they're just not ready to grapple with. So that's another reason why sometimes widowed older adults, and especially women, might be kind of subtly edged out of their social circles.
Interesting. And that's right there is another good reason to join a support group of contemporaries, because they will be in a position to understand completely what you're going through, and maybe even how to handle it, and certainly be way more sensitized to the mood that you're in, and helpful about how to deal with all those complex feelings, and a way to make new connections.
Peer support is so helpful. There were groups called Widow to Widow. The worst thing that you can say to a bereavement person is, I know how you feel. When you have not been through their experience, that's one of the worst things to say. But the other women or men in these peer support groups do know what you're going through, and they can give kind of concrete advice or insights based on that shared experience that both have had.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deborah Carr. This has been terrific and very enlightening. That's it for this edition. Let's keep the conversation going on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary. See you next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
You're watching PBS.